Everyone is destined for dust and ash. No matter your accomplishment, your pedigree, your wealth or power, there's nothing you can do to dodge the destination. That place where peasants and kings are once again united. 3,000 years ago, in Hebrew, it was referred to from Camelback as Sheol. I'm not sure what they called it aboard November 960 Lima Papa, a Daher TBM 960 traveling 5 miles high at 300 knots. Whatever it was, the married couple, parents of 3 boys, were about to drink of the cup. The surge in interest in high-speed, high-flying aircraft comes down to 2 things: the reliability, convenience, and pressurization capabilities of turbine engines, and the relatively low operating costs of singles. The trade-off is a lack of power plant redundancy. Still, it provides the ability for well-heeled, low-time owners to make use of high-performance cross-country machines. The result is short-time pilot operation in complex weather. Prior to the proliferation of these single turbines, those challenging environments were largely the purview of highly experienced and mercilessly trained professional pilots. You either bought an airline ticket or you spent a bundle on a twin jet with a crew. Though the TBM is certified for single pilot, there was a crew of 2 aboard this particular flight. In both forward seats sat rated pilots, a fine idea in any turbine aircraft. The only slightly unusual bit to this arrangement was that the 2 pilots were also husband and wife. The TBM Type 700 they were flying was born in the early 80s when Mooney Aircraft Company ran out blueprints for a pressurized single called the 301.
Shoulder harness is adjusted, you're secured. Yeah, I'll put mine on lock before we take off.
You'll be able to cruise at flight level 250 with a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet. Isn't that a beauty?
By 1985, Mooney was in the hands of French owner Socata. The new owners liked the idea of the 301, but thought it would be more interesting if a sleek turboprop hung from the nose. The TB in TBN stands for Tarbes, the Franco city where Socata is based. The M stands for Mooney, the stepchild they acquired in their infant marriage. The TBM 700 was the first high-performance, turbine-powered single to enter production. It would soon be joined by a fury of others. You don't need to read the manufacturer's press releases to sort that out. Fatal accident reports in the NTSB database will do just fine. The aircraft in question had been acquired by the owners brand new in 2022. Leron and Naomi Petrushka had founded UpWest, a Silicon Valley company tightly focused on funding the small niche of Israeli startups headquartered in the U.S. Though the aircraft they purchased was still typed as a TBM 700, it was marketed by its variant, the state-of-the-art 960. The aircraft comes equipped with what Socata calls HomeSafe, a big red button in the middle of the panel that will automatically land the aircraft in a pinch. In a Flying Magazine article, Socata Senior Vice President Nicholas Chabert compared the flight deck and control design of the 960 to a high-end Audi. The plane is equipped with a touchscreen Garmin 3000. The computers on board automatically send engine information to a data house after landing to ensure that the single Pratt & Whitney PT6 is up to snuff for future flights. A full authority digital control computer, FADEC for short, manages all of the important engine parameters. The propeller has its own computer to command pitch to the optimal position. There is also an auto throttle system, which automatically matches thrust to airspeed. Though speeds on approach can be as slow as 85 knots, the flaps-up maneuvering speed is a hearty 160. Keep that number in mind. We'll get back to it later. A common refrain among pilots is that accidents are quite a bit like a pantheon of Swiss cheese. If you have enough slices, tragic errors cannot find a path through the holes to a fatality. They'll inevitably hit a barrier and die in place of the occupants. What they don't tell you is that those holes are dynamic. When a pilot is well rested, the machine is well oiled, and the weather is clear in a million, those holes are tiny. If you find yourself shooting an approach down to minimum, surrounded by mountainous terrain, in the snow, with ice slinging off the wings and propeller, the holes become huge. The Swiss cheese model still works, you just have to stack extra barriers. Experience is one. The airlines don't let low-time pilots fly approaches down to minimums until they have a bunch of time on the airframe, and the combination of hours required between the 2 pilots to fly an airliner runs to several thousand hours at a minimum. The NTSB does not provide detailed flight experience for either of the 2 pilot occupants, only noting that the left seat pilot had amassed over 250 hours in the TBM. That's not necessarily a bad number, depending on what's behind it. It's not much of a drive from Lake Tahoe to Reno, where a first-class seat to Denver is an easy purchase. But you've got to deal with security and inevitable delays, and a TBM is more fun. Leron and Naomi were returning from a 3-day trip to Colorado. They had flown into Centennial Airport, a bustling corporate field that perpetually ranks among the most used in general aviation. The return flight followed the adage that piloting is 4 hours of en route boredom punctuated by a flurry of activity on final. Depending on the circumstances, it can be terrifying. On a good day, the visual approach to runway 20 is a riot of turns designed to dodge the ritzy residential neighborhood surrounding Truckee. The airport authority supplies an orientation video on their website for novices flying in. It's a good idea. Nestled in the mountains a mile high, there are plenty of dangers, but also tremendous beauty. On final to runway 20, you could put a picture frame around the North Star at Tahoe ski slopes. – 13,000 feet over Lake Tahoe, cut across the mountains to the northeast of the airport, turn base, descend to the procedure minimum sector altitude of 12,000 feet. That's how it all started, and it was unremarkable. As the TBM passed over the final approach fix, Lummo, the approach mode was turned on and the autopilot captured the descent path to the runway. The airplane continued past the various inner fixes in a stable descent, which, at 3.5 degrees, was slightly more aggressive than the 3-degree glide path that flat airports are blessed with. 2.5 miles from the runway threshold, the pilot keyed the mic in quick succession to turn on the runway lights. It was after 5, and the air traffic control tower for the small airport was closed. There was a notice that the visual approach slope indicator lights were inoperative for the runway. That left only runway edge lights rated to a maximum of medium intensity. The aircraft reached the minimum descent altitude at the same time it reached the visual descent point. Airspeed was 121 knots. On this approach, pilots are allowed by rule to level off at 6,480 feet and continue another 0.7 miles to Winnup intersection, where the missed approach procedure begins. Approximately 20 seconds after leveling off, the TBM had crept 300 feet below minimums and decelerated to 100 knots. If the pilot was training to see the runway directly in front of him, it would have been natural, but that wasn't where the runway was as he crossed the airport boundary. Due to terrain along the final approach path, the RNAV tracked 182 degrees magnetic throughout the procedure. This is misaligned 14 degrees from runway 20's 196-degree magnetic orientation. In the nomenclature of approaches, it was considered straight in, but the only time an aircraft would be perfectly aligned with the runway would be at the visual descent point, a good 1.5 miles from the end of the runway. Continuing inbound along the approach's 182-degree course, the aircraft would drift progressively to the left of centerline. The NTSB estimated that the aircraft passed 1,300 feet east of the runway threshold. At approximately this moment, the autopilot was turned off. Not long after this, the altitude hold mode was turned on, which would cause the flight director to maintain the current aircraft altitude. If the pilot was staring straight ahead, hoping for the runway through thick snowfall, likely the first thing he saw was the crossing runway 1129. It was at about this point when the altitude hold mode was deselected and the lateral navigation mode engaged, likely to execute the missed approach procedure, which, due to terrain straight off the end of the runway, involved an immediate right-hand 180-degree turn. The aircraft sped up, indicating that the thrust levers had been advanced, but aircraft altitude initially remained below the minimums for the approach. About 90 degrees into the right-hand turn, the aircraft began a climb to 6,750 feet. During this turn, a riot of buttons were pressed on the guidance panel. First, altitude hold, likely a mistake. They wanted to climb here and not maintain altitude. This was quickly remedied as the mode was deselected and the lateral navigation mode re-engaged. This would have provided guidance via the Garmin 3000 for the missed approach. The aircraft accelerated to within spitting distance of its 160-knot maneuvering speed, which, in the snow, demonstrated good discipline on the part of the pilot, especially considering that the plane wouldn't climb. All too common in these circumstances is a pilot slowing to an unsafe airspeed in a desperate attempt to outclimb the mountains. It's a shame. The pilot showed great discipline but also made a mistake. In the gale of activity following the rush go-around, the pilot seemingly forgot to raise the gear, a high drag device that penalizes even the turbine beast that a TBM 960 is. Not long after the missed approach was initiated, the aircraft began the appropriate right-hand turn but couldn't comply with an important caveat on the approach plate. The missed approach procedure required a minimum climb of 270 feet per nautical mile to 7,700 feet. The reason for this is plain on the chart. a hill that exists along the missed approach path, 6,817 feet tall. At 150 knots, the eventual speed obtained during the mist, an aircraft is traveling 2.5 miles a minute. 2.5 times the required 270 feet per mile is a climb rate of 675 feet per minute, normally a trivial target for the high-powered TBM. This minimum rate of climb assumes that the missed approach is initiated at Winub, the missed approach point, at the minimum descent altitude of 6,480 feet. On this day, the aircraft was closer to 6,200 feet and over a mile past Winub when the missed approach procedure began. Added to this, likely because of the gear, the TBM did not begin a meaningful climb until after another curving mile into the missed approach. As the aircraft turned towards Griot, it reached a peak altitude of 6,750 feet, 67 feet below the peak of the abutting hill. A ground proximity alert likely sounded in the aircraft. This would explain the final fatal maneuver. The missed approach began far too late, an error, intentional or not, on the part of the pilot, but was still salvageable. The 850 horsepower Pratt & Whitney can turn the $5 million six-seater into a rocket when needed. Even accounting for the substantial delay in initiating the missed approach, the pilot had the performance to clear the offending hill. But the combination of the delay in going around and the failure to retract the gear placed the aircraft on a razor's edge. The vast majority of missed approaches require hardly any climb gradient. They don't color in red or yellow the approaches that are highly dependent on aircraft performance. They only add, in lawyerly subtext, a couple of disjointed notes to relate the danger, a trifling reminder that can have fatal implications. In the moment, with the ground proximity system likely shouting at the pilot about the terrain, the abrupt hard turn to the left starts to make some sense. The aircraft was still in a shallow right turn at the moment, so the pilot turned back in the opposite direction. Logical, but a really bad decision. Some moments preceding this, the autopilot was turned off, a perfectly appropriate response to a ground proximity warning. There was some delay prior to the opposite turn to the left, either due to shock or, perhaps more likely, as the ground proximity warning oral escalated from
"Caution, terrain, 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 pull up, pull up."
If a pilot needs to deviate from a missed approach procedure under such circumstances, the safest place to do so would be in a turn towards the airport. There are never any substantially tall obstructions inside the perimeter, but the normal reflex is, if a right-hand turn caused the issue, turn left. The grave error is easy to see on the chart, a left turn driving the aircraft towards even higher terrain. This, too, explains why the left turn rapidly became progressively steep, the pilot likely attempting to turn away from danger via aerobatics in the clouds with ice slinging off the wings and propeller. The end result tragic and unsurprising. 3 kids lost their parents. This shouldn't be lost here. A successful Silicon Valley startup lost a founder. Less important. The scattered debris field was indicative of a high-speed impact. Notably, all 3 landing gear were found scattered along a railroad track, indicating that the landing gear had not been retracted. That $5 million wonder of modern engineering wound up on the wrong side of the tracks, along humble homes with tarp roofs. Kings and peasants. God bless them.